So let's get started, and thank you for joining the Keep Moving and Pivot webinar. This afternoon's webinar, the idea is to have a look at pivot tables, which I'm confident will dispel the myth that they're complicated, because they're really not. So we'll be having a look at a revision of data lists first of all to make sure that your data is pivotable, how to create a pivot table, sorting and filtering your pivot data, grouping your pivot data, and also having a look at some of those summary analysis calculations that you can put in. I am hoping that after you've seen this webinar this afternoon, it gives you some ideas of some spreadsheets that you might go back and review and maybe give pivots a go in them. So what is a pivot table then? Well, pivot tables are used to analyse data that's stored in list format. So just as an example that you can see on the screen there, this is only a small example, but usually pivots are used to analyse lists of data that have got many hundreds or even thousands of rows and lots and lots and lots of columns. Then when you come to analyse that data that's stored in a list, you find that you're showing and hiding columns, inserting rows and subtotals, taking them out, filtering data endlessly, lots of manual calculations that you put in there just to get you that bit of information that you need. The idea of a pivot means that you can quickly rearrange the data to analyse it from different angles. So just like I'm sure if you remember doing netball or basketball, quite a long time ago for me, but when you're playing netball, basketball, you use the pivot round so you can look at the field of play from different angles. And it's the same with an Excel spreadsheet, looking at the data from different angles. Most spreadsheets have columns across the top, headings across the top, so you can see the data that's in them, so you know what's what. With a pivot table, you can pivot that round and you can have headings across the top, got headings across here, and also headings down the side. And then in the middle, you have that summary analysis, so whatever value that you want in. And you can see that that's produced a much more compact list. So this pivoted data that I've got here is based on this raw data from the left. And I can actually see the whole thing and analyse it in one very small table. Long list of data then, it's just much easier to read. Once you've got a pivot table, you can do some common commands in there, such as sorting the data, you can filter the data. The fields, as I say, you can put additional fields in, take them out, move them around, pivot them around if you like. And in this example, you can see that Excel has decided to sum the test results from my underlying data source. Without having to create formulas, functions, calculations, you can quickly change the analysis of your pivot table. So you can look at different values and different results. You can create your own calculations within a pivot table if you need to, but they just make it so much easier to identify trends and analyze data without you having to do lots and lots of manual work when you're working with a list, doing lots and lots of manual calculations. Now you can pivot most kinds of data in Excel, but pivot tables are most commonly used when the list has got some kind of repetition and also something that it can analyse or evaluate, for example. So in my example that I've got here, there's lots of repetition. So we've got exam results for pupils. So each pupil is repeated because they've done different subjects in different terms. So with a pivot table, I could ask it to give me a summary of the English results, or a summary of the English results in summer, or a summary of rules of spring results, and all of this just quickly by putting it in a pivot table. They usually have, pivot tables that usually are based on data that also stores some kind of value, something that it can analyse. So with the test results that we've got here, instead of seeing an individual one for each person, for each subject, for each term, the pivot table would simply add those. If it was a text field that we were analysing, it would count the data, but for numbers, its default is to sum them. So before we start to have a look at putting a pivot table in, I just want to show you the underlying source data really. and make sure that the data that you're going to be analysing is actually structured correctly so that pivot table can understand it. A few rules. First of all, blanks are no good. So there's a blank column here. I've got a blank column C. So what Excel would do is it would look at that bit of data and think it's got nothing to do with this data over here because of the blank column C. So I'm simply going to right-hand click on the C and delete it. And that's now treating this area as a block. But Excel would now look at rows 3 to 10 and think that they've got nothing to do with rows 12 onwards because of this blank row 11 that's in the wrong place. So again, I'm just going to delete that out of my underlying data source. So I now have one big block of data that Excel can analyse. There is also a myth that blank cells are a no-no. You can have blank cells, that's absolutely fine. So these products that we've been selling, are they discontinued? Yes, if they've been discontinued, they'll have a date that they were discontinued. If they're not discontinued, they won't have a date. So blanks are absolutely fine. It's not an entirely blank column and they're not entirely blank rows. Now looking at the headings of your underlying data source for your pivot table must appear at the top of your table. And you can see here that I've got date and received in 2 separate cells. So Excel would look at row 1 as part of the headings, and it would think that received is part of the data. So I'm going to get rid of row number 2, it's not needed, and simply change the heading so I've got date received all in one cell. Now talking about the headings need to appear at the top of the table, not necessarily on row 1. So for example, you could have a heading at the top, but if your headings for the table start on row 5, then the data starts immediately underneath it. Just one last thing with regards to headings, we've got a merge and centered field here. So discontinued is merged across H and I5, and that's a big no-no. If I wanted to pivot that data, Excel wouldn't know whether I want the yes or no's or the dates. So I'm going to turn merge and center off, and each heading has to have a column heading at the top of it. The headings really should be unique, so we've got units in stock and units on order. We could have just units and units, but in order so that we can differentiate between the two when we're putting the pivot table together, just making the headings unique will make it all that much easier for us to create a pivot table. Okay, so we now have our underlying data source and we can pivot it. Right, so before we have a look at pivot table, I'm going to go to that exam results worksheet, which is set up perfectly. No blank rows, no blank columns, headings across the top, no merges. If I do Control and A, I can see that the whole block of data is selected and perfect for pivoting. Before you start your pivot table, you really need to plan it. Even if that's just a thought in your head, don't think you need to do lots and lots of drawings. Just a thought in your head, just for a second or two will do. And just ask yourself, what do you want? So what do you need to know from this data? And that will give you an idea for your pivot table. I often hear people saying the pivot table's wrong. The pivot table won't be wrong. What it's showing you will be factually correct. It's just what you need. You didn't need it to show you that. So ask yourself the question, what do you need? Go back to your pivot table and have a go at pivoting it round until it's right. So because we've got one big block of data, excuse me, simply clicking on a single cell inside the block will do to start a pivot table. I don't need to go highlighting cells or anything, just a single click on a single cell. I'm putting something into my spreadsheet, so I'm going to go to the Insert tab on the ribbon, and the very first command, because they're very popular, is Pivot Table. Okay, so here's your Create Pivot Table dialog box. So the first question is, where are you getting your data from? So what data are you analysing? So with pivot tables, they're a little bit like charts. You have to have that underlying data source before you can create a pivot. So they analyse existing data to pivot tables. And I don't know if you can see I've got marching ants going around the whole of my table, and Excel has automatically put the range in there and it's correct, so no need for me to do anything. You could use an external data source, so maybe a spreadsheet that's closed, or maybe even an Access database, but I'm using this table. Where do you want to put the pivot? Do you want it on a new worksheet? I do actually, yes. I could put it on an existing worksheet in a specific cell, and that's really handy if you're creating a dashboard of lots of little pivots to give you an overall analysis. But a new worksheet's fine. So if you reflect on this Create Pivot Table dialog box, I haven't changed anything. I've not touched anything. I'm just going to click OK. Here we go. We're starting now with our pivot table. When you create a pivot table, Excel, and I asked it to put it on a new sheet, so I've got sheet 1. Excel gives you a foundation, so almost like a foundation for a building for you to build the pivot table on. And when you're working with a pivot table, you get additional tools on the ribbon. So we have pivot table tools, analyze. So analyze is all about structuring it and getting the data right and making sure it's accurate. And then the pivot table tools design tab is all about making it pretty. So we'll have a look at the pretty stuff later on. We will start with analyzing. Now, if you click away from your pivot table, so I'm just going to click in a cell away from the pivot table area, those tools on the ribbon disappear now. I'm not working with a pivot table, so I don't need the tools. If they're not there, all you need to do is click on your pivot table and the tools will come back again. The main focus of a pivot table, the main structural area of a pivot table is this area down the right-hand side of my screen, the pivot table fields list. This is switched on automatically. On the Analyze tab, the last 3 buttons are automatically activated. So the field list button is the third from last one. So if I finish designing my pivot, I could take that away just to tidy the screen up. Any amends, click on it again and it pulls it back, and then you can start modifying your pivot table. Notice how the headings that were in our underlying data source are appeared in the fields that we can choose from to include in our pivot table. Excel calls these fields, so I suppose a little bit like a farmer would look in his cabbage field for his cabbages or his lettuce field for his lettuces. If I wanted to find a pupil, I'd look in the pupil field, and so on. Each of these fields, and you don't have to use all of them, because many spreadsheets that I see have got 20, 50 columns. You don't need all of them adding into your pivot table, but they do need to go in one of the 4 structural areas that you can see at the bottom of the field list. Like values, starting with values is the simplest one. So this is sort of like the middle section of your pivot table, and this is what will be analysed. And Excel takes a bit of a guess as to where you want the field to go. If I simply tick test results, Excel looks at the data that's in that field in the underlying data source, knows that that contains values, so adds the field into the values area and automatically assumes I want to do a sum of the test results. So no calculations for you to do, Excel does it for you. So we have a sum of the test results, and my pivot table is updated immediately, and I can see the overall sum is 2,653. Keep that in your head. I could have gone to the results sheet and at the bottom just done an auto sum to give me that same value, but then I don't always need it at the bottom, so I have to take it out again. Whereas in our pivot table, we're going to pivot around. So 2653 doesn't really tell me anything. What I'd like to know is, out of that 2653 overall total, how well did each pupil do? So now I'm going to tick the pupil field. And notice how Excel assumes that you're going to want to display that data across rows. So each of the pupil is displayed in a row across the pivot table. I still have that grand total of 2653, but now I've got a breakdown to show me the subtotal for each of the pupils. So remember, each pupil has done different exams, English, Maths, Humanities, in different terms, spring, summer, autumn. So this is the total for that particular pupil for all subjects in all terms. The idea of pivoting is actually that's not what I wanted. I didn't want to see a summary for pupils, so I'm just going to untick it to take it away. and maybe have a look at the summary for term. So still with the 2653, but now it gives me a breakdown for each of the terms in my underlying data source. Or take that away and maybe have a look at subject. So still with a grand total of 2653, I think you're getting it now, but it gives me a breakdown of each of the subjects. So ticking fields, if it had a value in it, Excel put it in the values area. If it had text, it assumed it wanted to go in the rows area. So where do these two come into play? So this is where the idea of pivoting things comes around and looking at things maybe from different angles. So the subject field, I know that ticking it is just going to put it in the rows area. So I'm just going to get hold of it and drag it into the column area. The same data, grand total 2653, but the data is displayed in column format as opposed to row format. Probably not as easy to read when you've only got one field in there. But if I also tick the pupil, which goes in the row area, okay, pivot table is now starting to take shape. So we have the subjects across the top, the pupils down the side, and in between, if I have a look at maths for hips, the overall total was 42, with a grand total for every single term and subject of being 166. Easy, just clicking and dragging to move your fields around. If there's a field that you don't need, you can either untick it, or you can simply drag it away from the pivot table area. I don't know if you can see that my mouse has got a little X underneath it there, and just let go. So ticking is one option to get the fields into your pivot table. Excuse me, I'm going to drag the subject back into the column. I'm going to drag this time the pupil into the row, and I'm going to drag the term into the filters area, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay. So looking at my data that I've got here, you can't break a pivot table. If it's not right, if it's not doing what you want, maybe just delete it and take a different approach, or pivot it round until you get to what you want to see. So I know that this data here, the English subject for Ashley, that's 60, that total is wrong, it should be 70. You can't actually change the underlying data source from a pivot table. If I try and overwrite that with a 70, there we go, you can't change this part of a pivot table. So it's not possible to mess with the data. If that data is wrong, I would have to intentionally go back to the underlying data source. So it was Ashley's English results that were wrong, and I can see that that's the reason why, because it says 12 and it should be 22. So I've intentionally changed the underlying data source. When I go back to the pivot table, the data hasn't changed yet, but if you think about when you're working on websites, if somebody's updating the website with, like, I don't know, cricket results, as those results change, you may need to refresh your page every now and again. And it's the same with a pivot table. So on the Analyze tab of our pivot table tools, I'm simply going to refresh the data, which you can see by pointing to the tool. You can also use Alt and F5. I'm just going to refresh the data. And there we go. That's pulled through that new value, calculating it for me. You may need to do that every now and again. The pivot table will refresh itself if you were to close and save and then reopen the spreadsheet. So on open, it will refresh as well. Sorting, I'm sure you've all done sorting before. Quite unique in the way that Excel can sort pivot data, and there's lots of different ways that you can do this. First of all, at the top of the rows, there's a little drop down arrow. So I could sort the names of the pupils in alphabetical order, A to Z or Z to A. Even the subjects that are running horizontally, I can sort those as well. So I can sort them Z to A or A to Z. You can, if you wish, use the field list. So if you hover over a field, use the drop down arrow and you can use sort A to Z, Z to A. Personally, I prefer a right hand click. So just right hand click on any one of the pupils and choose your sort order. Right hand click on any one of the subjects and choose your sort order. You can even right hand click on a value. So I want these to go lowest to highest, so smallest to largest, and organise the data within your pivot. And you could do that for any column of data. Filtering, very similar, and I'm sure you've done lots and lots of filtering in the past. So with filters, again, on your row labels and column labels, you can use the drop down arrow. You can put in your own text filters, value label filters, or use the tick boxes to display the data that you need. Now that subtotal will change because you've taken some of the data away. You can sort on the column labels as well, or filter on the column labels. I'll just take humanities away. I can't remember what we did in humanities. And again, it leaves you with the data that you need, and with a symbol on the pivot table, the filter icon, to let you know that there's a filter applied. Just going back to those three buttons that I showed you on the ribbon to start with. So field list, we know what that does, shows and hides the field list. If I get rid of the field headers, it does take away the sort and filter options on the pivot table. But you can go back to using the field list at the right hand side and use the drop down, and I'm just going to clear the filter from pupil and clear the filter from the subject. I actually prefer the field headers on, I suppose it's just used to seeing them there, I suppose. Right. Just to take this a little further, I'm sure you've used sort and filters to some degree previously. The column labels and the row labels will allow you to filter each field. We haven't looked at this filters, this term that we put in the filters area of the pivot table yet. And I don't know if you've noticed, the term sits above the whole of the pivot table. Any of the fields that you put in the filters area puts a high level filter across the whole of the pivot. So at the moment, this whole pivot is showing us all our terms. By simply clicking on the drop down arrow, I could say, just show me autumn. So it's filtered the whole data, the whole spanning across the whole thing. You can even, with this filters area, tell Excel that you would like to select multiple items. It is lacking in some of the other options that you have for column and row labels, but it is an overall filter, so you really wouldn't need too many options here. I'm just going to take that term away from a pivot table, and I'm going to take the subject away as well. So I have a very simple pivot here, 2663. Now we added that extra 10 on, and I can see each of the pupils and their test results for all of the subjects for all of the term. Now I would like to put a filter on the pivot table to show me different subjects. So just keep in mind, subject at the total at the moment is 2663. I haven't got the subject field on the pivot table, and I don't want it on the pivot table. I just want a very simple pivot. So from the field list, I'm going to apply a subject just for the functional skills, English and math. And OK. So it appears that it's put a filter on. It's certainly showing me that there's a filter applied in the field list, but the subtotal hasn't changed, or the grand total hasn't changed. So it can't possibly have applied the filter. So I think that tells us that unless you add the field into the pivot table, you can't apply a filter. Okay, so let's clear that filter. But I want to apply a filter by a field that's not on my pivot table. I don't want to add the field in, but I do want to filter it. And that brings us on to our Analyze tab and these additional filter features that we have. They're like interactive filters, and they're great if you're ever needing to do a demonstration or a presentation to a room of people who they don't know what the underlying data source is and might throw different questions at you. So I'm going to put an interactive filter slicer in so that I can quickly see the subject that I want to see. Okay, so this filter slicer, because I'm clicked on it, if you have a look at the ribbon, it has its own set of tools. So you can change it, make it prettier, just change the colours. You can maybe change the number of columns that the buttons are displayed in, depends how many buttons you would have. You can change the height of the buttons, the width, and even move it around. So that's making it pretty, but what's the purpose of a slicer? So I have all my pupils here, but I only want to see humanities. So I click on humanities, and it takes away the data and leaves me with just the results for humanities. If I want to see everything again, I can just clear that filter and maybe just see English. You can use your shift key. So if I hold down shift and click on humanities, that will let you pick a selection, so English, French and humanities. Or you can use your control key, so you can pick up multiple items that are not next to each other. And for each one that's highlighted, those are the totals, those are the resulting totals. Now then, that's just fantastic. I think if you agree, just give me a yes. If you disagree, give me a no, that's fine. So filter slicers, I'm going to put another one in. So start off by clicking on the pivot table, have a look at the Analyze tab, and we're going to insert a slicer, this time for the term. So now I have two slicers, and I can say, just show me summer. Just show me summer for French. Okay, show me all of the subjects, but just for autumn. Or show me all of the terms, but just for humanities. And using those interactive slicers, I think you'll agree that if you are doing any kind of presentation with facts and figures, it just is so easy. And the audience could sit there and say, oh, actually, what about? And ask you questions, and you just press a button. I'm going to go to our data list now, this original spreadsheet that we had a look at. And I'm going to insert a pivot table. Again, the data range is right because we fixed that earlier. Yes, put it on a new worksheet, that's fine. And for this one, I would like to see the various English names, and I would like to sum up the prices. And there we go. So quite a few bits of data in there. By the way, you can apply just basic formatting just as you would to any other spreadsheet if there's any formatting that needs applying. Okay. So for this particular slicer, I would like it to be based on the date range. And that's where the interactive timeline slicers comes in. So when I add an insert timeline, the only field it offers me is a field that actually contains a date. So I'll tick date discontinued and OK. So from this timeline from here, I could ask Excel to show me, just show me the values from August. So not many in August. What about August through to October? Or July? Oh, not much data in here at all, is there? There we go. So the data's earlier. So just December and January. Just January. You can even drag along to include extra months. You can display the timeline as months, quarters, or days. So let's have a look at quarter 4, or the whole year. Quarter 1 to quarter 4. And the data updates for you immediately. So I really like using the slicers. I think they're great and very intuitive. You don't have to know the data to find what you're looking for. So we've now got two pivot tables, one based on the data list data and another one based on exam results. I want to show you grouping now. So back to our exam results, I'm going to insert another pivot table. Again, no need to change the settings in the dialog box. They're absolutely fine. And I'm going to go back to tick the test results. So it's doing a sum of, we're going to have the subject in the column and the pupil in the row. Okay. Grouping data is just the idea of having more than one field in more than one area. So the pivots that we've seen so far, I've only put one field in the row area or one field in the column area. But if I get hold of the term and drop it also in the row area, now I've dropped term above the pupil. So each term is then subdivided down by each pupil. You get a subtotal for each term because that's at the top field, that's the topmost one. And then the data is split down underneath, and you still have that grand total with our 2663 at the bottom. Pivoting it round, actually, let's get hold of the term and drop it below the pupil. So this time, we get a subtotal for each pupil, which is then broken down by each term. If you're not interested in the data and just want to see the subtotal, you can expand and collapse each one of the grouped headings. If you want to do the whole lot, click on one of the group headings, and on your ribbon, you can collapse the whole field or expand the whole field. Might be quicker if you've got a couple of hundred headings rather than clicking minus, minus, minus to collapse the data. Again, it's getting it right, getting the data right, and the grouping doesn't always look right. So I've got the subject in the column area. What happens if I put the term above the subject? Okay, so it's same data, but on a horizontal view. So this time I've got autumn with a total for autumn and a breakdown for each one of the subjects. And the same for spring with a breakdown for each one of the subjects. And it's just a case of getting the data right until it looks okay to you. Pivot it round, drag it round until that initial question where you said, I need this, what do I want from the data? This is what I need to show me. Then you get the totals in here. Okay. I'm going to move on and have a look at pivot calculations. So the fields that we've put in so far, we've had a sum of the test results. And I want to do a little bit more with the data, and the test results for these exams, the data is a little bit limiting. So I'm just going to use another spreadsheet called stock report. So there's a few more columns and a few more rows in here. The data's all structured okay, so I'm going to insert a pivot table immediately. And I've already got a plan of the data that I want to see. So I would like the category field. Category, have I missed it? So the category is going to go in the row area. I would like whether it's discontinued or not in the column area. And in the value area, I want the price. And because it's a value field, Excel just automatically does that sum of price. So just remember what we're saying about the fact that you could format this data. So this is currency, so you could format the data. So that's great, that's absolutely fine. But I don't want to display the data as a sum, I want to see averages. Now, if this was a normal spreadsheet, you'd start putting your own formulas in or changing the formulas around. Not with a pivot table, it's just a setting. So I'm going to hover over this sum of price, use the drop down arrow and change the settings of this value field. And there you go, just simply change it from a sum to an average. Again, with your formatting, you could display it to a specific number of decimal places. I always get those wrong, I always go up instead of down. You could display it to a specific number of decimal places, so those are your averages. Or you could even change it, so again, going back to the value field settings, change it to a count. Or even going back to value field settings and change it to a sum. Brilliant. Okay. So just looking at these values that we've got here, I can see that let's go with the discontinued ones, which the smaller values are easier for me to comprehend. So beverages is 315. What is £315 as a percentage of the overall total? £12,217. So what percentage is 315 of 12,000? And you're probably thinking, oh no, I don't really want to be starting doing working out percentages at this time on an afternoon. But I do want to see that. I want to see each one of these figures as a percentage of the overall total at the bottom. Same with these and same with these. So easy to do in a pivot table. Just go back to your sum of, back to the value field settings. So the summarized value, that's the summary analysis for the statistical functions that you can use. But I want to show the values as something specific. It says it's got no calculation in there at the moment. Well, I would like to show the values as a percentage of the column total, and click OK. There we go. So that 300 that we're looking at is 2.58% of 12,271. And you can see that for each of the totals here. And you'll know it's right because the grand totals appear at the bottom. If we were to change that, show value field settings, show value as, maybe change it to percentage of the row total. So we've got the same thing, but horizontally. And we're talking about having dashboards earlier. So I'm going to show the values as no calculation. So I'd like the best of both worlds. So with the calculations, I want another pivot table. So this one to show me the values and then another one to show me the percentages. I could put another pivot table in, go back to the original data and maybe choose that as the new data source. Or you can just simply copy the original pivot table, paste it where you want it to go. Let's remember the column width. And for the new pivot table, change the value field settings to show the value as a percentage of the column total. Perfect. So having lots of little different pivot tables might make it easier for you to see the data. While we're looking at, I suppose, while we're looking at creating dashboards, it's actually quite nice as well to have graphical data. So whichever pivot table I click in, so I'm just going to click in the left one with the values. From the Analyze tab, I want a pivot chart, not just a chart, a pivot chart. So Excel comes up and suggests this is the best sort of chart that I can think of based on that data. Okay, well, let's have a look at it. And there we go. So pivot charts, they have the functionality of a pivot. So on here, I can choose whether I want to see discontinued, filter the ones I don't want, and that will affect the underlying pivot too. So if it's discontinued, I don't want to see it. And that leaves me with the data and both the pivot and the chart update. Or I could filter the pivot to update the chart. So I want to take beverages away. And both the pivot table and the chart update together. A little bit of jiggery-pokery with the data could make it a little bit easier. And then maybe using the pivot chart tools to do some formatting. You have a pie chart with a specific layout and colours. And it just makes your little dashboard look nice and interesting and easy to see. I hope you're finding this really useful. By the way, I don't know how true this is, but I've been told that if you copy a pivot table and paste it and then change it, the new pivot table takes up less file space than it does creating a new one. So don't quote me on that, but that's what I have been told. Just conscious of time, so I want to finish off with a bit of formatting. So I'm going to go back to my original data source. I'm going to insert another pivot table, the last one for today. And the structure, I'm going to have the discontinued in the column, so whether it's discontinued, yes or no. I would like the category name in the row area, and I want it to group by category. And underneath each category, I want to see the English name. And I want to give this an analysis of the actual stock values, so how much I've got in stock of each of these items. So we've had a look at 45 minutes. I know that we can't give you tell you everything about pivot tables. Hopefully this has given you a good overview. But the commands that we've looked at on pivot tables have been on Analyze. We haven't looked at the Design tab. And as I mentioned, this is all about making it pretty. So Excel gives you a whole range of built-in styles to choose from. Some of them are a bit more garish than others. And I know that some organisations you have to use corporate colour schemes for spreadsheets and documents and presentations that you create. I can do what I want this afternoon. So we're going with purple. Then the tick boxes next to the styles, you can switch on and off the formatting that's been applied. So I can turn row headers off, but then I think that makes it difficult for each of the categories to stand out. So I'm going to switch those back on. Column headers, yeah, I think those need formatting as well. Banded rows puts formatting on to draw your attention horizontally, to read the data horizontally, or banded columns to read the data vertically, or you can add both on. I don't want either, to be honest. I'm going to take those off. The subtotals that's in here, personally, when I'm looking at subtotals, I always look at the bottom of the list. So it is likely that I'm going to read the beverages total as 12,000 rather than 23,000. But that's easy sorted. So again, on the design tab, from subtotals, I can turn them off if I don't want them, but I'd like to see the subtotals at the bottom of the group as opposed to the top. And there we go. So that makes life much easier, personally for me, not for everybody, but it's nice to know that you can do that. Do you need the grand totals? So we've got a grand total in the last column and also on the bottom row of our pivot table. So for grand totals, you can turn them off for rows and columns, on for rows and columns, just have rows on or just columns on. I'm going to turn them all off. And the different layouts will also show you your pivot table in different forms. And I quite like that one. So I'm going to stick with that as my pivot table layout for today. And I think for what we've had a look at this afternoon, I hope you found looking at pivot tables nice and easy. Got some ideas of how you're going to go away and maybe put these into practice. Have a play around with those spreadsheets that I've put in your handouts. But yeah, go back and have a look at your spreadsheets that you've got and see if a pivot table would work and see if you can use them. So all that's left for me to say is, have you got any questions? Do you want to just use the chat panel at the right to ask any questions? Oh, good, thank you. So it looks like Anthony's been doing all of this manually. There is a quick survey for you to fill in at the end of the webinar, if you wouldn't mind. So if there's any questions that you haven't asked here, or if I haven't answered them as we've gone along, please feel free to use those and ask any questions. I will review them after the webinar. The webinar recording will be on our website probably after 10 a.m. tomorrow. Thank you ever so much for attending, and I hope you join us on some of our future webinars in the next couple of weeks. So thanks again, guys. It's lovely to see you all again, and take care and stay safe. Thank you.